Hi, this is Ryan Narayan at the Kaspersky Security Symposium here in Munich. I have a very special guest with me here, Mr. Stefan Tanase from our Romanian office. Stefan works with our global research and analysis team, and he is here to talk about the emergence of targeted attacks as a big, very important issue in the industry. And Stefan, I want to start off by asking you to make the differentiation for me between a regular malware attack and what we determine to be a targeted attack.
Right. There are a couple of differences between classic malware attacks and what we call targeted attacks. I think the most important thing is that when talking about targeted attacks, we're talking about much higher stakes here. We're talking about things like intellectual property theft or corporate espionage, while with classic malware, of course, it's the classic story about an uneducated computer user who gets his or her credit card stolen or banking account stolen.
Would you say the business user, the average enterprise, small, medium-sized business is more likely to be a victim to a targeted attack versus the average consumer?
Well,
that's fair.
Of course, targeted attacks require much more resources than launching classic malware attacks. So having much higher stakes involved, of course, the targets will be things like big corporations, even small and medium businesses, but probably never the end user. Except, of course, let's say if the end user would be a really important person, right, which is not part of a big company.
Right. And the other thing is, with targeted attacks, a lot of effort and resources, like you mentioned, is spent actually preparing the attack. Talk a little bit about what goes into identifying a victim and preparing the attack in stages to make sure the attack is completely successful at the end.
Right. So there are a couple of steps that can generally describe a targeted attack. And the first step, and I think one of the most important ones, is the reconnaissance step. This is where cybercriminals try to gather as much information as possible about their future victim so that they can ensure the successfulness of their attack. Right. After the reconnaissance step is done, they move on to the next step, which is the technical step, which is creating a new and unique malicious sample, which probably wouldn't be detected by the AV solution that's being used by the potential victim, and making sure this malware goes right through their network filters, firewalls, and everything. After that, it's the third step, which is basically just mixing the technical payload with the specially crafted social engineering technique, to basically launch the attack. And then the fourth step is actually getting access over the network, moving around, seeing whatever is interesting there, whatever is not interesting, and getting the important data out of that.
Let's start a little bit with reconnaissance, because you mentioned reconnaissance, and reconnaissance becomes a very, very crucial part of it when you're actually figuring out who the target is and what's the best way to reach that target. And we've found recently that there's a lot of information publicly available voluntarily by end users on social networks. So although targeted attacks might be a business enterprise problem, the publication of information on consumer social networks like Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and so on becomes very important in the reconnaissance part. Can you talk a little bit about some of the kinds of information that might be available on LinkedIn that might be useful to an attacker?
Right. Actually, social networks right now are a real goldmine for cyber criminals, because until recently, the reconnaissance part would have been a very time and resource-consuming part for the cyber criminals. But with the advent of social networks lately, when more than 500 million people are posting their most intimate details of their daily lives on social networks like Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn, all the information is basically already out there, easy to use, easy to access by cyber criminals. Social networks have APIs, so cyber criminals can basically automate the process of getting all this information and using it to better target their attacks.
Targeted attacks became kind of a mainstream news story. It's always been around. Targeted attacks have always been happening, but just over the last, I would say, 3 months, it's become a mainstream news story with the admission by Google that their networks were compromised in the Aurora attacks. And more recently, the highest stakes, what we consider highest stakes, Stuxnet attack. Talk a little bit briefly about what Aurora was and what Stuxnet was, and then if we can have a little discussion about the differences there and where we see targeted attacks moving.
Well, at the time when the Aurora attacks surfaced out, they were considered the most sophisticated and targeted attacks seen so far. Well, Aurora basically affected a couple of big companies. Google was among them, and probably this is why the story got so much mainstream attention. But when looking at Stuxnet and comparing it to Aurora, it really makes you wonder if Aurora was actually worth discussing and
if it was worth the headlines.
Exactly, if it was worth all the ink used for the newspaper headlines. Because when looking at Stuxnet and comparing it to Aurora, we see things like, well, Aurora was being delivered using a 0-day in Internet Explorer 6, which is a 10-year-old
against
product.
Windows XP,
exactly,
which is an older.
Well, Stuxnet had a couple of vulnerabilities, 4 of them which were 0 days, and it was using them to penetrate systems as old as Windows 2000 and as new as Windows 7. So these are a couple of differences. Now, the other thing was Stuxnet was using 2 certificates to sign its drivers. Certificates which were not self-signed, were actually real certificates stolen from 2 legitimate companies, Realtek and J-Micron. These companies have their headquarters in the same business park in Taiwan, which of course is fueling up all the conspiracy theories.
To all kinds of speculation, right?
Right, exactly. And then the third thing is that Stuxnet was actually not let's say, a weapon for corporate espionage, but more likely a weapon for corporate sabotage, because its target wasn't the normal PC. It was those PCs that were running the SCADA networks, which are networks that are controlling production environments in factories, generally automation that happens in power plants, production factories, and things like that, which are really important things, you know.
So one of the really more interesting things about Stuxnet for me was the fact that there were not just 1 or 2, but there were 4 different Windows 0-day vulnerabilities, and the fact that only one was originally discovered during the actual attack, the link file Windows shortcut vulnerability. Talk a little bit about just how sophisticated and intense this attack was, using 4 different vulnerabilities, and what went on behind the scenes between Kaspersky Lab and Microsoft in getting that fixed.
Well, you're actually making a very good point. It's usually something special for a piece of malware to use 1 0-day vulnerability, but when you have 4 0 days, it makes you really ask yourself exactly a couple of questions. Now, the thing was, at first we discovered the first vulnerability was discovered, the link file vulnerability. And after that, companies like us and other AV vendors started really reversing and getting into whatever Stuxnet had to hide in its really big binary, because the binary was about half of a megabyte in size, which is really huge. In the end, we ended up realizing that there are 4 0-day vulnerabilities, out of which 2 of them were discovered by Kaspersky. We spent more than 2 months working together with Microsoft behind closed doors, making sure that the binary itself is reversed as deeply as possible, making sure that there is no more 0-day vulnerabilities except these ones. And at the moment, everything is known and everything is currently patched.
Thank you very much, Stefan.
Thank you, Ryan.
Hopefully at the end of this discussion, end users get a sense of where targeted attacks are going and how the emergence of social networks and information freely available on public repositories play into the hands of these targeted attacks, and the fact that they're becoming more and more sophisticated as time go on. So from the Kaspersky Security Symposium here in Munich, I want to thank Stefan for being here with us, and thank you for watching.